You still have one good decision left tonight. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A loaded gun was pointed directly at Jack Sullivan's face, and the man didn't even put down his coffee cup. 53 customers watched from the floor. Two armed men stood between them and the door, and the only sound in that diner was the hum of a refrigerator and the distant whine of an 18-wheeler passing on the highway outside. Nobody knew a camera was recording every second of it. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end and drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Jack Sullivan had been riding motorcycles for 39 years, and in all that time he had developed exactly one hard rule about how to read a room. Watch the hands. Not the eyes, not the face, not the voice. The hands told you everything you needed to know about a man, whether he was nervous, whether he was bluffing, whether he had already made up his mind about what he was going to do next. Hands didn't lie the way faces did. Hands couldn't be coached or controlled. When a man's hands started shaking, it didn't matter what his mouth was saying. It was a Wednesday night in late October when Jack first noticed the hands. He was sitting in his usual booth at Sunset Junction Diner, the corner booth second from the back, the one where he could see both the front door and the kitchen pass through at the same time, nursing his second cup of coffee and talking to nobody in particular. That was one of the small luxuries of being 57 years old and chapter president of one of the most recognizable motorcycle clubs in the state of Arizona. You earned the right to sit in your corner and not explain yourself to anyone. The diner was quiet for a Wednesday. Maria Delgado was working the floor, moving between tables with the efficient energy of a woman who had been waitressing for 16 years and had no interest in wasting a single step. Two truckers sat at the counter eating pie. A young couple in the far booth were sharing a plate of fries and keeping their voices low. An older gentleman in a canvas jacket was reading a newspaper by the window, the pages folded exactly in half the way men of a certain generation always did. Three other Hells Angels riders sat at a table near the jukebox: Danny Kowalski, who everyone called Wrench because he'd been a mechanic before he retired, and Bobby Flores, who was 44 years old and hadn't smiled sincerely in about 6 years, and Pete Garland, who was the youngest of the group at 38, and still had the habit of drumming his fingers on tables when he got bored. They were talking about a broken carburetor on Pete's bike, a disagreement that had apparently been ongoing for about 3 weeks and showed no sign of resolution. The bell above the front door chimed at 12:17 in the morning. Jack didn't look up right away. He heard the door, heard the cold air come in from outside. You could always feel the October wind before you saw it, and he reached for his coffee cup without turning his head. Then he heard the second set of footsteps. Not one man coming in, two. And something about the rhythm of those footsteps, the pace of them, the way they stopped too quickly just inside the door made Jack set his cup back down without drinking from it. He looked up. The first man through the door was wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up and a bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. He was young, Jack could tell by the build, by the way he was standing, and he was holding a handgun at chest height with both hands pointed at the ceiling. His eyes were moving too fast, scanning the room in rapid jerks the way a man's eyes moved when his heart rate was already in dangerous territory. The second man came in behind him, posted himself against the wall beside the door. He had a shotgun sawed off, which told Jack it had been modified deliberately, which told Jack these were not amateurs who had grabbed the first weapons they could find. This had been planned, or at least someone had tried to plan it. "Nobody move," the first man shouted. "Hands on the table, right now. Hands on the table, everybody." His voice cracked on the last word. That was the first thing Jack registered. Not the gun, not the mask, the crack in the voice. Maria froze in the center of the floor, a coffee pot in her hand, her whole body gone rigid. The two truckers at the counter both went very still. The older man by the window lowered his newspaper with a controlled, deliberate movement of someone who understood that sudden motion was a bad idea. The young couple in the back booth, the girl made a sound, half a gasp, half a whimper, and the young man grabbed her hand under the table. Wrench, Bobby, and Pete had stopped talking about the carburetor. Jack Sullivan did not put his hands on the table. He looked at the two men in the doorway, and he took a slow, measured breath, and he wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Sir," the first robber said, his voice climbing, "hands on the table." I said, "Hands on the table." "My hands are busy," Jack said. The words came out completely flat, not defiant, not aggressive, just matter of fact the way a man might respond if someone told him to stop reading a book he was enjoying. He lifted the coffee cup, took a sip, and set it back down. The diner went so quiet that everyone could hear the refrigerator unit humming in the kitchen. The robber with the handgun took 2 steps toward Jack's booth. "Are you, sir? Are you serious? Right now I have a gun." "I can see that," Jack said. He looked at the young man directly, not staring him down, not challenging him, just looking at him the way you looked at a person you were trying to understand. "I can also see that your hands are shaking." Nobody said anything for a long moment. "My hands are not shaking," the robber said, but his voice gave him away immediately, the denial arriving too fast and too loud, the way a denial always did when it wasn't true. Jack tilted his head very slightly. "Son, I've been watching people's hands for almost 40 years. Those hands are shaking." Maria made a small sound from the center of the floor, something between a prayer and a plea. The coffee pot was still in her hand, forgotten. The second robber, the one by the door with the shotgun, said, "Ethan, stop talking to him. Get the register." So the first one was Ethan. Jack filed that away. Ethan Cole, though Jack didn't know his last name yet, was 27 years old, blonde, and looked like he hadn't slept properly in about a week. His eyes were bloodshot above the bandana. He was wearing work boots, not sneakers, which meant he had a job or had recently had a job. And despite the gun and the mask and the door he had just kicked in there, was something in the way he was standing that didn't fit. Something apologetic. Something that didn't belong in the body language of a man who had decided to become a criminal. "Ethan," the one by the door said again, sharper this time. "Register." "Right," Ethan said. He moved toward the counter, toward Maria. "The register. Open the register." "Please." "Please." Jack heard that word land in the room like a stone dropped into still water. He saw Maria blink, watch the small, bewildered furrow appear between her eyebrows because armed robbers didn't usually say please, and the incongruity of it had apparently reached her even through the fear. "The register," Ethan said again. His voice had dropped. He sounded almost apologetic. "Just open it. I don't want to scare you." "You already scared her," Jack said from his booth. Ethan turned back toward him. "Sir, I'm asking you to please stop talking." "I know you are. I have a gun." "You mentioned that." The one by the door, Travis Boyd, 29 years old from Tucson, though none of that was known yet, pushed off from the wall. "What is wrong with you?" he said to Jack. "Are you crazy? Do you have a death wish?" "Neither," Jack said. He picked up his coffee cup again. "I just don't scare easy." Travis raised the shotgun. He didn't point it at Jack directly, but he raised it, a clear escalation of visual warning. "You should." From the table by the jukebox, Wrench cleared his throat. It was a quiet sound, barely audible, but Travis swung toward it, immediately the shotgun coming up, and stopped. Because he was suddenly aware of 3 more very large men in leather vests sitting at a table not 15 feet away from him, and none of them were on the floor, and none of them were scared, and the patches on their vests told a story that Travis Boyd had apparently not anticipated when he chose this particular roadside diner as his target. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Travis looked at the vests, then he looked at Jack, then he looked back at the vests. His jaw moved, but nothing came out. "You picked this diner," Jack said quietly, without doing a lot of research. "I didn't," Travis started. He stopped. Started again. "Just everybody be calm, okay? We just want the money. We're not here to hurt anyone." "Then that's something," Jack said. Maria had moved behind the counter. She was at the register now, her fingers on the keys, and Jack could see her hands trembling from 20 feet away. She got the drawer open. There wasn't much in it. It was after midnight on a Wednesday at a highway diner. Maybe $300 at most. Ethan leaned over the counter and looked at the bills in the register, and something crossed his face that Jack had not expected to see. Not satisfaction, not relief, defeat. It was the face of a man who had driven a long way and risked everything and arrived to find exactly the wrong thing waiting for him. Ethan Cole stared at that register drawer for a long moment, and Jack watched the shoulders drop inside the hoodie, watched the gun hand lower by about 3 inches, and understood something that none of the other customers in that diner had yet understood. This robbery had not been planned because these men wanted money. It had been planned because they were desperate. There was a difference, and Jack Sullivan had been around long enough to know what that difference looked like. "There's maybe $250–300 in there," Jack said. Ethan didn't look up from the register. That's not going to solve whatever problem you're trying to solve tonight, Jack said. Travis was moving now, tense and agitated, the shotgun swaying. Stop. Stop talking. Why do you keep talking, Ethan? Bag it up and let's go. Travis, Jack said. The name landed like a slap. Travis spun toward him, and Jack saw the exact moment the young man realized he had just been identified, had just been named out loud in front of witnesses, and the fear in his eyes went from controlled to something sharper and more unpredictable. How do you... Travis stopped. His voice had dropped. How do you know my name? Jack nodded toward Ethan. He said it. About 2 minutes ago when he was trying to get you to move faster. He watched the realization travel across Travis's face. You're Travis. He's Ethan. And neither one of you has done this before. You don't know that. Your partner says please to the cashier he's robbing. You've said 3 times that you don't want to hurt anyone. Jack wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. You're not career criminals. You're 2 men who ran out of options, or think you did, and landed here. On a Wednesday? At midnight. He paused. At a diner full of Hell's Angels. The refrigerator hummed. Ethan turned away from the register and looked at Jack for the first time without the gun raised between them. His eyes were red-rimmed. He looked exhausted in the specific way that had nothing to do with missing one night's sleep, and everything to do with months of grinding, daily accumulating exhaustion. The kind that settled into a man's bones and didn't leave. You don't know anything about us, Ethan said. But his voice had lost its edge. It sounded almost like a question. Tell me I'm wrong, Jack said. Nobody moved. Not Maria, not the truckers, not the old man with the newspaper who had very quietly folded it and placed it on the table and was now sitting with his hands very still. Not Wrench or Bobby or Pete, who had been sitting silent through all of this, with the patience of men who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was absolutely nothing. Travis took 2 steps toward the booth. The shotgun was up. Ethan, we are leaving right now. Take the money and come on. Travis, Ethan said, right now. There's barely anything in the register. Then we go find somewhere else. There is nowhere else, Ethan said. His voice broke on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough. There is nowhere else, Travis. I've been looking for 6 months. There is nowhere. We're already past the line here, okay? We already came in here with guns. That's done. That already happened, and we got $250, and Nolan is going to want $15,000 by Friday morning, and I don't know what else. I don't know what. He stopped talking. His hand with the gun dropped to his side. He stood in the middle of Sunset Junction Diner at 12:23 in the morning and stared at nothing. Nolan. Jack turned the name over in his mind. Nolan. Not a bank, not a company, a name. One name said with the particular kind of exhausted hatred that a man only used for someone who had real specific personal power over him. Who's Nolan? Jack asked. Travis moved fast. He crossed the floor in 3 strides and grabbed Ethan's arm. Don't say another word. Not one more word. We're leaving. It's not going to help, Travis. Ethan's voice was flat now. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't going along either. He was just standing there like a man who had used up the last of something and had nothing left to spend. You know that. $250 doesn't help. Nothing we do tonight helps. Ethan. Travis's voice was low and urgent and frightened. Stop. I'm tired, Travis. He said it very quietly, almost to himself. I'm tired. The gun was hanging at his side. His arm had dropped fully now. The muzzle was pointed at the floor. Jack Sullivan set his coffee cup down on the table. He didn't slam it. He didn't make any dramatic gesture. He just set it down, and then he leaned forward slightly, and he looked at Ethan Cole with the kind of direct, uncomplicated attention that most people never gave anyone anymore. Look at me, Jack said. Ethan looked at him. How much trouble are you really in? That question sat in the air of Sunset Junction Diner for a long time. Travis was still gripping Ethan's arm. The truckers at the counter hadn't moved. Maria was standing very still behind the register with her hands pressed flat on the counter. The young couple in the back booth were leaning together, the girl's face buried against the young man's shoulder. And Ethan Cole, 27 years old, first-time criminal, standing in a diner full of people he had just terrorized with a gun that had dropped to his side without being pointed, at anything, looked at Jack Sullivan and his jaw worked, and he said nothing. But his eyes said everything. Jack had spent 39 years reading people. He had met men who were dangerous and men who were lost and men who had convinced themselves that those two things were the same. He had sat across from county sheriffs and federal investigators and had been called before more than one judge. He had lived a life that polite society considered rough. And he had never once apologized for it because the life had given him something that polite society rarely produced, an almost surgical ability to look at a human being and understand what they were actually made of underneath the surface they were presenting. What he saw in Ethan Cole's eyes in that moment was not a criminal. It was a man who had run out of road. The two things looked different. Jack had spent enough time with both to know. "You said his name?" Jack said. "Nolan. You said it like he owns you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Loan shark," Jack said. It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. "How long?" Jack asked. "Jack." That was Pete from the table by the jukebox. His voice was very quiet. Just the one word, a check-in, a question. "Are you sure about this?" Jack didn't look at Pete. He kept his eyes on Ethan. "How long has he had you?" "Don't answer that," Travis said. He was still holding Ethan's arm, but the grip had changed. He wasn't pulling anymore. He was just holding on. "Don't tell him anything." "Travis." Ethan pulled his arm free, not violently, just firmly. He turned back to Jack, and then he said in a voice so flat and tired it barely had any emotion left in it at all, 8 months. The number landed in the room like something physical. 8 months, whatever the debt was, whatever the interest rate, whatever Nolan had been collecting, 8 months of that kind of arrangement could destroy a man. Jack had seen it before, had seen it up close, had watched people he knew get caught in the machinery of men like Nolan, men who found the desperate and the vulnerable and offered them a lifeline that was actually a trap that tightened every week, that multiplied while you slept, that turned ordinary people into thieves and worse, because there was simply no other direction left. "Medical?" Jack asked. Ethan blinked. Something shifted in his face. "What? Was that what started it? Medical bills?" A long pause. "My daughter, Bomb," Ethan said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She was 3. There was a surgery. She's fine now. She's okay now, but the bills..." He stopped. "I couldn't pay it. I couldn't pay any of it. And Nolan said he could help." The diner was absolutely silent. Travis had lowered the shotgun. He probably hadn't realized he'd done it. Maria was still standing behind the counter, but the terror on her face had changed into something else. Something more complicated. The old man by the window had picked up his newspaper again. He wasn't reading it. He was just holding it. Jack Sullivan reached across the table and picked up his coffee cup. He took a long sip, set it back down, and looked at Ethan Cole. "Sit down," he said. Ethan blinked. "What?" "Sit down." Jack nodded at the booth across from him. "Both of you, put the guns on the table where everyone can see them and nobody has to be scared, and sit down." Travis made a sound that was half a laugh and half something that couldn't decide what it was. You want us to sit down, in the middle of a robbery." "The robbery's over," Jack said. "You got $250 from the register. That's not going to help you and you know it. So either you leave with $250 and you're back where you started just with $250, that doesn't matter, or you sit down and tell me about Nolan." He paused. "Because I have a feeling Nolan is a bigger problem than just the two of you." Travis looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the booth. He looked at the gun in his hand. Then he walked to the booth and sat down. He placed the gun on the table muzzle, pointing at the wall away from everyone. His hands were shaking again. He pressed them flat on the tabletop and took a breath. After a moment, Travis crossed the floor and sat down next to him. The shotgun he placed under the table on the bench seat beside him, where everyone could see he'd put it down. Maria let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for about 6 minutes. Jack Sullivan looked at the two young men across from him, and he thought about everything he knew about men like Nolan. He thought about the machinery of it, how it worked, who it targeted, how many men like Ethan were out there right now in the same trap being squeezed the same way. He thought about a daughter who'd had surgery at age 3 and was fine now. He thought about 8 months. He picked up his coffee cup. "Start from the beginning," he said. And Ethan Cole, 27 years old, in a diner in Flagstaff, Arizona, at 12:28 in the morning with a gun on the table in front of him and 3 Hells Angels riders 10 feet away, and a security camera recording everything from above the coffee machine, began to talk. He talked for a long time, and what he said changed everything. Not just for him, Not just for Travis, not just for the 53 people in that diner who sat and listened without moving, barely breathing while the story came out. What Ethan said that night would eventually put 7 men in federal prison, erase the debts of 64 families across 3 states, and produce 22 seconds of security camera footage that would be watched more than 50 million times before the year was out. But none of that was known yet. Right now, there was just a young man with shaking hands and a gun on the table, and a story that had been eating him alive for 8 months. And a man in a leather vest who was listening. Really listening. The refrigerator hummed, the coffee grew cold, and nobody left. Ethan started with the hospital. He didn't start with Nolan. He didn't start with the debt or the interest or the threats. He started the way most men started when they finally told the truth after a long time of not telling it from the beginning, from the moment that everything that came after became inevitable. His daughter's name was Lily. She had been born healthy, had spent her first 2 years being exactly what a 2-year-old was supposed to be: loud and curious and destructive, in the particular joyful way that small children were destructive. And then 3 months before her 3rd birthday, she had started falling down. Not the way toddlers fell, the comedic, rubbery tumbles that ended in laughter. The other kind, the kind where her legs simply stopped working without warning, without reason, without any explanation that Ethan or his wife Casey could identify. They took her to their primary care doctor, then to a specialist, then to a hospital in Phoenix that had a pediatric neurology department. The diagnosis took 11 weeks. The surgery was scheduled 6 days after that. By the time Lily was out of the operating room and the doctors were telling Ethan and Casey that she was going to be fine, that she was going to walk and run, and probably not remember any of it, by the time she was old enough to have memories that stuck, by that point, the billing department had already generated the first invoice. $240,000, Ethan said. He said it the way people said numbers that had stopped feeling real. Flat, almost without inflection. That was after insurance. After everything. That was the number left over. Nobody in the diner said anything. Travis was looking at the table. He'd heard this before clearly. He was looking at the table the way you looked at something you had heard so many times that it had worn grooves into you. I went to 3 banks, Ethan said. 2 credit unions. I talked to everyone I could think of. Casey's parents didn't have it. Mine were gone. I had maybe $12,000 in savings, and that went inside the first month. He stopped, picked at a scratch in the table surface with one fingernail. That's when one of the guys at my job told me about Nolan. What's his full name? Jack asked. Ethan looked up. Why, because names matter. Jack kept his voice level. What do they call him? Nolan Pruitt, Travis said. He said it like the name tasted bad. He runs out of a pawn shop on the south side. But the pawn shop is just the front. Everybody knows it. Nobody does anything about it because... He stopped. Because why? Jack asked. Travis and Ethan exchanged a look. The kind of look that carried a conversation in about half a second. Because he has people, Ethan finally said, in the right places. Jack let that sit for a moment. He didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that you didn't push a man who was just starting to trust you with the part of the story he'd been afraid to tell. You let him arrive at it himself. He gave me $60,000, Ethan said. Said it was a bridge loan. Said the interest was 18% annually, which sounded high but not insane. Not for someone in my situation with no collateral, no credit left. He paused. Except that wasn't the actual interest rate. The 18% was monthly. He pressed his lips together. I should have read it more carefully. I know that. I know. You were sitting in a hospital, Maria said. Everyone looked at her. She was still behind the counter, but she'd moved slightly, gravitating toward the conversation without seeming to realize she'd done it. Her arms were crossed over her chest, the coffee pot still hanging from one hand. You were sitting in a hospital looking at your 3-year-old daughter, she said. You weren't reading carefully. Nobody would have. Ethan looked at her. Something crossed his face that was too complicated to name. Thank you, he said quietly. Maria gave a small nod and didn't say anything else. 18% monthly, Jack said, doing the math without showing it, on 60,000. It compounds, Ethan said. The way he writes the contracts, it compounds on the unpaid balance, and there are fees for late payment, and the fees compound too, And within 4 months, I owed him more than I'd borrowed. I was making payments. I was making them every week, but the number kept going up. He looked at his hands flat on the table. I lost my job in month 5. Company downsized. Casey picked up extra shifts, but her income alone, it wasn't. He stopped again, swallowed. Nolan sent someone to the house. A guy, big guy, stood on my front porch and talked to me very quietly about what happened to people who stopped paying. Jack's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that Wrench, who had known him for 14 years, noticed it from across the room. He didn't threaten Lily, Ethan said. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. He looked up. His eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. He said a man's priorities tend to clarify when the right kind of pressure gets applied. Then he got back in his car and left. The diner was absolutely still. The old man by the window had put his newspaper down. One of the truckers at the counter was looking at the floor. How much do you owe him now? Jack asked. $14,800 is what I managed to get it down to. Took me 6 months of everything, every side job, everything Casey and I could sell. We got it down to 14.8. Ethan's voice went flat again. He said I had until Friday to clear the balance. All of it, or he was going to start applying the other kind of pressure. What's Friday? Jack asked. 4 days from now. Jack said nothing for a moment. From the table by the jukebox, Pete said very carefully, and what does the other kind of pressure look like? Ethan and Travis both looked at Pete, then back at Jack. We don't know exactly, Travis said. But Kenny Marsh guy we both knew from high school, he owed Nolan money 2 years ago. Couldn't pay. 6 weeks later, Kenny's in the hospital. Hit and run. Except everybody knew it wasn't a hit and run. He stopped. Kenny walks with a cane now. His right hand doesn't work right anymore. He's 29 years old. The information dropped into the room like something heavy. Jack picked up his coffee cup. It was cold. He drank it anyway. He was quiet for long enough that Travis shifted in his seat, the way people shifted when silence made them nervous. What do you actually know about Nolan's operation? Jack asked. Not what you've heard, what you know. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? I mean, how many people does he have loans with right now? What does his paper look like? Who are his people in the right places that you mentioned? Jack kept his voice even. Because 2 men walking into a diner with guns to pull down $250 from a register, that tells me you are completely out of ideas. And before I can figure out whether there's a better idea, I need to understand what we're actually dealing with. Travis stared at him. You said we. I did. Why? Travis's voice had sharpened. Not hostile exactly, but pointed, genuinely asking. Why does any of this matter to you? You don't know us. We walked in here with guns. We scared all these people. He gestured vaguely at the diner. Why would you help us? Jack set his cup down. He thought about the question. He didn't have a short answer, and he wasn't a man who liked to give answers that were shorter than they needed to be, just to avoid the effort of honesty. Because Nolan Pruitt sounds like a man I've heard about before, Jack said. Different name, different city, same machine. And because I'm 57 years old, and I've been wrong about people plenty of times, but I'm not wrong about you two. He looked at both of them steadily. And because a 3-year-old girl's surgery is the reason you're sitting in this booth, and I've got a daughter of my own. Silence. Then Ethan said, you have a daughter. Grown now, 26. Jack paused. She's a nurse, actually, pediatric ward. Ethan looked at the table. His jaw moved. He didn't say anything, but it was clear the coincidence had reached him somewhere he hadn't expected. Wrench stood up from the table by the jukebox. He walked over slowly, not threatening, just moving, and pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat down at the end of Jack's booth. He was a big man, Wrench, not aggressive about it, just solidly built in the way of men who had done physical labor their whole lives. He set his forearms on the table and looked at Ethan and Travis. You mentioned he has people in the right places, Wrench said. Law enforcement. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Local, county, or further up. We don't know for certain, Ethan said. But when Kenny got hurt, the investigation went nowhere inside of 2 weeks. He made a gesture. Gone. And Kenny was told by someone in the department to stop making statements. Bobby Flores had gotten up from the jukebox table now too. He walked over quietly and leaned against the side of the booth, arms folded. He didn't speak, but his presence changed the geometry of the conversation, and both Ethan and Travis were aware of it. How many people do you think he has in loans right now? Jack asked. I know of at least 8, Ethan said. People who came to him the same way I did. Medical stuff mostly, or sudden job loss. He targets people who are desperate but not broke, people with assets he can eventually take, or people with steady enough income that he can milk them for a long time. He stopped. There's a woman, Linda, something older woman. I met her once in Nolan's waiting room. She's been in the loan for 2 years. She was crying in the waiting room and trying not to show it. Maria made a sound from behind the counter, something short and involuntary. Jack heard it. He didn't look at her directly, but he heard it and he noted the particular quality of it. Okay, Jack said. He sat back. He looked at Ethan and Travis for a long moment. Then he said, here's what's going to happen tonight. Travis sat up slightly, wary. You're going to put the $250 back in the register, Jack said. Travis's eyes went wide. What? You didn't take it for Nolan. You took it because you were panicking, and panic makes people do things that don't actually solve the problem. Put it back. He looked at Maria. Maria, is the register still open? Maria blinked. It is. Ethan, Jack said. Ethan reached into his hoodie pocket and produced a folded envelope. He placed it on the table. Maria came forward from behind the counter, took it, and went back to the register without a word. Her hands were still slightly trembling, but her face had settled into something resolved. Now, Jack said, the second thing. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and placed it on the table. I'm going to make a call, he said. There's a man I know. He's an attorney. He works with cases involving predatory lending, and he has worked with federal prosecutors before. He is not going to ask me why I'm calling him at 12:30 in the morning, because he knows that when I call it matters. Jack looked at both young men. But before I make that call, you both need to understand what you're agreeing to. We didn't agree to anything, Travis said quickly. No, Jack said. Not yet. I'm asking if you want to. He leaned forward slightly. If you agree to cooperate to tell the attorney everything you told me, plus everything you know about Nolan's operation, the names, the people he has on the payroll, the other borrowers you know about, there is a path here that doesn't end with you two in federal prison. It is not an easy path. It is not a guaranteed path, but it exists. Ethan stared at him. And if we don't, then you walk out of here with whatever was in your pockets when you came in and you figure out Friday on your own. Jack held his gaze. But you won't figure out Friday on your own. You know that. The silence stretched. Travis was looking at Ethan. Ethan was looking at the gun on the table, the one he'd put down 20 minutes ago and hadn't touched since. Pete spoke from the jukebox table where he'd returned to his seat, but had been listening to every word. The attorney's name is Carl Whitfield, Pete said. For what it's worth, he got 3 guys I know out of situations that looked a lot worse than this one on paper. Travis turned to look at Pete. You know him, fictional. Jack's had his number for 12 years. Travis looked at Jack. Why? Jack allowed himself the smallest possible version of a smile. Because I'm 57 years old, and I run a motorcycle club in Arizona. You don't survive that long without knowing a good attorney. Despite everything, the guns on the table, the fear that was only just now starting to drain out of the room, the full weight of what had happened in the last hour, Travis Boyd almost laughed. It came out as something between a breath and a snort, but it was real, and it broke something open in the room that had been locked tight since the front door had swung open. Ethan reached out and put his hand on the phone on the table, not picking it up, just touching it. If we do this, he said, his voice was very careful, if we tell him everything, what happens to us? What happens to me and Travis? I'll be honest with you, Jack said. I don't know exactly. You walked in here with guns. That happened. It's on the camera. It's in the memory of every person in this room, and it doesn't disappear. What I can tell you is that cooperation means something. Context means something, right? And a man who walked into a diner out of desperation and walked out having put the money back is a different man in front of a judge than the version of this story where you leave with the $250 and Nolan's people find you Thursday night. Ethan was quiet, then, my daughter can't have her dad in prison. I know that, Jack said. She's 3 years old. She just learned to walk again. I know. Jack's voice was steady. That's why we're doing this tonight, instead of some other way. Outside, a truck went by on the highway. The sound of it rose and faded in about 10 seconds, and in the space it left behind, Ethan Cole nodded. It was a small nod, not dramatic, not accompanied by any speech. He just looked at Jack Sullivan and moved his head once decisively, and that was it. Travis exhaled. He'd been holding his breath without knowing it. His shoulders dropped about 2 inches. Jack picked up the phone. He dialed from memory, the kind of memory that came from having a number stored not just in a phone, but in your head, because you'd been wise enough to know that sometimes phones got lost or broken or confiscated. It rang 3 times, then Jack, Carl Whitfield's voice. Awake, not groggy, a man who slept lightly apparently. "What time is it?" "Late," Jack Fillin. "I need you to come to Sunset Junction Diner on the 89. I need you here in person." A pause. "Tonight, tonight." Another pause. "Is everyone safe?" Jack looked at Ethan, at Travis, at Maria, who had come out from behind the counter and was now standing closer to the booth than she probably realized listening. At the truckers, who hadn't left. At the old man by the window, who was still there. "Everyone's safe," Jack said. "But I've got 2 young men here who are going to need someone in their corner before morning." He could hear Carl moving on the other end of the line, keys jangling, a door, the rustle of someone putting on a jacket in a hurry. 45 minutes, Carl said. "I'll have coffee waiting," Jack said. He hung up. He looked across the table at Ethan Cole, who was 27 years old and hadn't slept properly in 8 months, and had a 3-year-old daughter who had learned to walk again. "Okay," Jack said. "Now I need to know everything about Nolan Pruitt." And that was when Ethan started talking about the ledger. The ledger that nobody outside Nolan Pruitt's operation was supposed to know existed. The ledger that listed every borrower, every payment, every fee, every contact in law enforcement and local government who had been paid to look the other way, every collection action taken against every person who had ever fallen behind, detailed, dated, cross-referenced, and stored in a safe in the back office of the pawn shop on the south side of Flagstaff. The ledger that Ethan knew about because 6 months ago, in a moment that Nolan Pruitt had probably never stopped regretting, he had left Ethan waiting alone in his office for 11 minutes while he took a phone call in the hallway, and the safe had been open. Jack Sullivan set his coffee cup down very slowly. "You saw it," Jack said. "You actually saw inside." "I didn't take anything," Ethan said quickly. "I didn't touch anything. But I saw it. I saw the pages. I saw the names." He looked at Jack. "I saw a name I recognized. A lieutenant from the county sheriff's department. There was a number next to his name, a dollar amount, and a date from 8 months ago." The refrigerator hummed. Nobody spoke. Then Wrench very quietly said, "That's not just a loan shark." "No," Jack said, "that's not just a loan shark." Maria sat down. She pulled out a chair from the nearest table and simply sat down like her legs had made the decision without her. Travis said, "This is why we couldn't go to the police. This is why I kept telling Ethan, you cannot go to the police with this because we don't know who Nolan has and who he doesn't." "Carl Whitfield goes to federal," Jack said. "Not local, not county." He looked at Ethan. "If that ledger is what you're describing, this is a RICO case, racketeering, corruption. That goes past anything Nolan has bought at the local level." Ethan's eyes had changed. The flatness was still there, the exhaustion, the months of grinding fear that didn't just dissolve because one conversation had gone differently than expected. But underneath it, something else. Something that had been dark for a very long time and was just starting to consider that it might not have to stay that way. "You think they could actually get him?" Ethan asked. Jack didn't answer immediately. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything, directly, without comfort, without false reassurance. "I think," he said, "that a man who keeps a ledger that detailed is a man who trusts his protection too much. And that kind of trust is a vulnerability." He looked at Ethan steadily. "I've seen it before." From above the coffee machine, in a position that nobody in the diner had thought about once, since the doors had burst open an hour ago, a small camera with a wide-angle lens continued to record. It recorded Jack Sullivan's face. It recorded Ethan Cole's hands pressed flat on the table, no longer shaking. It recorded Maria pulling her chair closer and refilling Jack's coffee without being asked. It recorded the moment that Travis Boyd reached across the table and picked up the gun that Ethan had placed there and handed it to Jack Sullivan handle first. "I don't want to hold on to it anymore," Travis said. Jack took it. He held it for a moment, then passed it back to Wrench without looking who took it. Without comment, the exchange so practiced and unremarkable that it was clear this kind of thing had a protocol. While we wait for Carl, Jack said, I want you to write down every name you remember from that ledger. Every name you saw on those pages. Anything you can remember, amounts, dates, anything. I remember a lot of it, Ethan said quietly. I've been trying to forget it for 6 months and I can't. Good, Jack said. Don't forget it tonight. Maria appeared at his table with a fresh cup of coffee and a notepad, the kind waitresses use for orders, small and spiral bound, and a pen. She set them both in front of Ethan without any ceremony. He looked up at her. Thank you, he said, and it was different from the thank you he had said before. It was fuller. Right, she said and went back to the counter. Ethan picked up the pen. And in the corner booth of Sunset Junction Diner, under the recording eye of a camera that nobody had thought to check the story of Nolan Pruitt's operation, began to come apart at the seams, one name at a time, in the careful handwriting of a young father who had run out of road and found against every reasonable expectation that the road had not actually ended. It had just turned. Carl Whitfield arrived in 41 minutes. He was a compact man in his early 60s, wearing a jacket over a sweater that he'd clearly grabbed in a hurry, and he came through the front door of the diner with the particular energy of a man who had spent his career being called at inconvenient hours and had long since made peace with it. He stopped inside the door, took in the room, the bikers, the truckers who still hadn't left Maria behind the counter, the young couple in the back who had been too stunned or too riveted to go anywhere, and then walked directly to Jack's booth. He looked at Ethan, at Travis, at the notepad in front of Ethan already half full. He sat down. He looked at Jack. Tell me, he said. Jack told him. It took 12 minutes. Carl listened without interrupting, which was the mark of a man who had heard a great many things over a great many years and understood that the act of listening without commentary was itself a form of skill. When Jack finished, Carl looked at the notepad. He picked it up and read what Ethan had written, his expression giving away nothing. Then he set the notepad down and looked at Ethan directly. The ledger, Carl said. Tell me exactly what you saw. And Ethan began again. Above the coffee machine, the camera recorded all of it. Every word, every name, every minute of a night that had started as a robbery and become something that none of them, not Jack, not Ethan, not Travis, not Carl Whitfield, not Maria, who kept refilling coffee cups as if that were the one thing she could control, in an uncontrollable night would ever fully be able to explain to people who hadn't been there. Because some things didn't translate. Some things you had to be in the room for. And this was one of them. Carl Whitfield had a particular way of writing notes that Jack had noticed over 12 years of knowing the man. He wrote in a tiny compressed hand, the letters so small they were almost illegible to anyone else. And he wrote fast, not in bursts, but in a continuous, steady stream, like a court reporter who had learned to translate spoken word into written word without the middle step of processing. He wrote while Ethan talked, and he wrote while Travis added details, and he wrote while Jack occasionally asked a question that redirected the conversation back toward specifics, toward dates and dollar amounts and names, the things that attorneys needed and that stories required to become cases. By 2 a.m, Carl had filled 11 pages of the small notepad that Maria had brought to the table. He capped his pen, set it on top of the notepad, and looked at Ethan Cole for a long moment without speaking. The ledger, Carl said. I want to go back to the ledger. Ethan had been talking for the better part of an hour. His voice had the rough quality of a man who had used it past its comfortable limits, and he was on his third cup of coffee, which Maria had refilled each time, without being asked and without comment, the act of refilling having become her way of participating in something she clearly felt she had a stake in. What about it? Ethan asked. You said you saw it here for 11 minutes. You were alone in the office. Carl kept his voice neutral, deliberately without pressure. Did you photograph anything? Ethan was quiet for a beat too long. Travis turned and looked at him. Carl said very carefully, Ethan, this is the room where you have to tell the truth, not the version that sounds better. The actual truth. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his hoodie. He pulled out his phone. He placed it on the table face up. Nobody said anything. I took 11 pictures, Ethan said. I know I shouldn't have. I know what it looks like. But I was sitting in that office staring at that safe, and I could see the pages, and I thought, I thought maybe someday I'd need it for protection, in case something happened and I needed to prove something. He looked at Jack. I wasn't trying to blackmail him. I want to be completely clear about that. I never used them. I never showed them to anyone. They've been sitting on this phone for 6 months. Carl had his pen uncapped again before Ethan finished the sentence. Jack picked up his coffee cup and drank. Above the coffee machine, the camera recorded Ethan Cole sliding his phone across the table to Carl Whitfield. It recorded Carl's face as he looked at the screen for the first time, the careful, controlled expression of a man who knew how to not show what he was thinking, but whose stillness itself communicated that what he was seeing mattered. It recorded Jack Sullivan watching Carl's face, and it recorded the exact moment Carl looked up from the phone and said very quietly, "Ethan, this is enough." 2 words that landed in the room like a different kind of gunshot. Ethan's whole body reacted before his face did. His shoulders came forward, his hands gripped the edge of the table, something in his chest either breaking open or closing up. It was impossible to tell which. "Enough for what?" he said. His voice had gone thin. "Enough to build a federal case." Carl set the phone down carefully. "These photos are not clean evidence. There are chain of custody issues. There are questions about how they were obtained. I won't pretend otherwise. But as a roadmap, as a starting point for a warrant, this is more than I've walked into a U.S. attorney's office with on cases that went all the way." He picked up his pen. "I need you to tell me every name you can identify from these images. Every single one." Travis let out a breath. He'd been holding it for what sounded like a full minute. Wrench, still at the end of the booth, said nothing. But he leaned back in his chair with the subtle shift of a man who had been carrying tension in his body and was now very slightly releasing it. Ethan started naming names. He named 7 people from the ledger pages he'd photographed. 2 of them were names that Carl wrote down without visible reaction. 3 of them made Carl's pen slow, almost imperceptibly, the tiny hesitation of a man cross-referencing what he was hearing against something he already knew. And 2 of the names made Carl stop writing, entirely look up and say that again. The second name Ethan repeated was Raymond Stills. Carl said, "Raymond Stills II or Raymond Stills III. Ethan stared at him. "How many Raymond Stillses are there?" "In Flagstaff, 2 that matter." Carl set his pen down. "Raymond Stills II is a retired county commissioner. Raymond Stills III is his son. He currently sits on the State Judiciary Oversight Committee." The diner was so quiet that the sound of a truck shifting gears out on the highway was perfectly audible, rising and falling and gone. "The third," Ethan said. He said it like he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. Carl picked his pen back up. He wrote something, then he wrote something else. Then he sat for a moment with the pen hovering over the notepad and said to no one in particular, "Well, that explains some things." "What things?" Jack asked. Carl looked at him. There was something in his expression that Jack had not seen before in 12 years, not quite surprised because Carl was not a man easily surprised, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man whose map of a situation had just been substantially redrawn. "There was a federal inquiry into predatory lending in this county 18 months ago," Carl said. "It went nowhere. The investigator was reassigned. The case files were," he paused choosing the word, "misrouted. Nobody was ever able to clearly explain what happened to them." Travis made a sound. It came out halfway between a laugh and something that wasn't a laugh at all. "Misrouted. The Stills family has been in Arizona politics for 40 years, Carl said. "Raymond III has a reputation as a reformer, anti-corruption. He gives speeches." He looked at the notepad. "Remarkable." Jack said, "Can you protect these 2? Carl looked at Ethan and Travis. He considered it the way he considered everything directly without sentimentality, because sentimentality in an attorney was a liability that his clients couldn't afford. "If they cooperate fully with a federal investigation," Carl said, "and if the investigation goes where these photos suggest it should go, yes. There are provisions, whistleblower protections, prosecutorial cooperation agreements." He looked at Ethan specifically. "It is not painless, it is not fast, but the alternative is Friday morning." Ethan nodded, the same kind of nod as before, small, decisive, done. Travis said, "What do we do right now, tonight?" "Tonight?" Carl said, "You don't go home." Travis blinked. "What? If Nolan Pruitt has a contact in county law enforcement, and your names are in his system in any capacity, and after tonight, there's a reasonable chance something gets flagged. Then going home puts you in a position where someone who doesn't want this information to reach a federal desk has access to you. Carl closed the notepad. You're coming with me, both of you. I have an office, I have a secure phone, and I have a contact at the FBI field office in Phoenix who owes me a significant professional favor. He stood up from the chair. We're going to use it tonight. Ethan looked at Jack. Jack nodded once, the kind of nod that meant this is the right move. Ethan pushed out of the booth and stood up. He was unsteady for just a moment, not quite physical, more like a man whose body had been running on adrenaline and fear for hours and was only now beginning to calculate the cost. He steadied himself against the table edge and took one breath, then another. Travis was already on his feet. Ethan looked around the diner. He looked at the two truckers who had stayed at the counter for the past 2 hours without explanation, who had simply not left, who had sat and listened with the quiet solidarity of strangers who had decided without discussing it that leaving felt wrong. He looked at the young couple in the back booth, the girl leaning against the young man's shoulder with her eyes open watching. He looked at the old man with the newspaper who met his gaze without looking away. Then he looked at Maria. Maria was standing at the counter with her arms folded and her chin slightly lifted, the posture of a woman who had been scared out of her mind 2 hours ago and had chosen somewhere in the middle of all of it to stop being scared and start being something else. I'm sorry, Ethan said. He said it to her directly. For what I did when I came in, for scaring you. Maria looked at him for a long moment. Go take care of your daughter, she said. That's the apology I want. Ethan's jaw worked. He nodded. Carl was moving toward the door. Travis had started to follow, then stopped and turned back to the booth. He looked at Jack. Why did you do this? Travis said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. The question of a man who couldn't quite make the math work and needed to understand the variable he was missing. Jack looked at him. He thought about giving the short answer, the one that would have fit neatly and moved things along. Then he gave the real one. Because you still had one good decision left, Jack said, and you made it. Travis stared at him. Then he nodded one sharp dip of the head and followed Carl out the front door. The bell above the door chimed. Then it was quiet. Jack Sullivan sat in his corner booth in the silence that followed, and he did not move for a long moment. Pete and Bobby had come back to his table. Wrench was still in his chair. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute, which was unusual for men who generally had opinions about most things. Pete finally said, So, that happened. That happened, Jack agreed. Bobby unfolded his arms. You think the attorney can actually do something? Carl Whitfield put a sitting city councilman in federal prison in 2019, Jack said. Yes, I think he can do something. The truckers at the counter exchanged a look. One of them, older heavyset with the deeply weathered face of a man who had driven long haul for 3 decades, said to nobody in particular, Best cup of coffee I ever had the occasion to drink. Jack almost smiled. Maria started clearing tables. She moved with the same efficient economy as always, but there was something different in it, a kind of deliberateness, like each small task was being done with more intention than usual. She collected cups and straightened chairs and wiped down surfaces, and when she got to the booth where Ethan and Travis had been sitting, she stood there for a moment before wiping it down, looking at the notepad they'd left behind, at the careful handwriting that Ethan had filled it with. She picked up the notepad. She held it for a moment, then placed it carefully under the counter. Evidence, she thought, though she couldn't have explained how she knew that's what it was. Jack watched her do it. He didn't say anything. His phone buzzed. He picked it up. A text from Carl already less than 10 minutes after leaving. Both secure, making the call now. Don't discuss details with anyone until you hear from me. Jack read it twice. Set the phone down. Carl's making the call, he said to the table. Wrench said FBI. Tonight, apparently. Pete whistled softly. Fast. Carl doesn't move slow when he has something real, Jack said. And what those photos show, that's real. He looked at the phone for another moment. Raymond Stills III. I want to know more about that. I'll look into it, Bobby said quietly. Bobby Flores had spent 8 years in the Army before he'd found his way to the chapter, and he had a particular gift for finding information that wasn't publicly presented as findable. Jack trusted this gift completely. Quietly, Jack said. Bobby gave him a look that communicated without words, that quietly was the only way he operated. It was past 3 in the morning now. The diner should have closed at midnight, which meant Maria had been running on empty and adrenaline for 3 hours past her shift. The old man by the window had finally stood up, left a 20 on the table, significantly more than his coffee cost, and walked out with a small, wordless nod to Jack that Jack returned. The young couple had left sometime during Carl's arrival, slipping out quietly while everyone else was focused on the conversation. The two truckers were still at the counter. One of them turned around on his stool and looked at Jack. He was maybe 60, with the kind of face that had been in the sun for most of 6 decades, and he had the direct, unhurried manner of a man who said what he meant and didn't say much else. "You always like this?" he asked. Jack looked at him. "When something goes sideways," the trucker said. "You always that calm?" Jack considered it. "No," he said, "not always." "What's different tonight?" Jack turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Those two boys weren't killers. I knew that inside the first 90 seconds. He looked at the cup. "When you know that the rest of it is just a conversation." The trucker thought about this for a moment, then he turned back to his pie. His partner, younger, quieter, the kind of man who observed everything and volunteered nothing, said from the stool beside him, "My brother-in-law got into a loan situation like that 3 years ago. Didn't end the way tonight ended." Nobody asked him to elaborate. He didn't. Jack's phone buzzed again. "Carl, FBI Phoenix field agent will be here by 6 a.m. Both men are cooperating fully. The photos are being looked at by someone who knows what they're looking at. Sit tight." Jack read the message. Sat tight. Maria came over to the booth with the coffee pot. She poured without asking which was the right call. She looked at Jack in a way that was different from the way she'd looked at him at the beginning of the night. Not afraid, not even just the ordinary, comfortable familiarity of a waitress and a regular. Something more than that. The look of a person who had been through something with another person and knew it. "What happens to Nolan Pruitt?" she asked. "That's for the federal government to determine," Jack said. "But what do you think?" He looked at her. "I think the ledger catches up with men like Nolan. It always does. They keep it because it's power, and they keep it too long because they believe their protection is permanent. And permanent protection doesn't exist." He picked up the coffee cup. "It just exists until it doesn't." Maria nodded slowly. "And the woman in the waiting room, the one Ethan mentioned, Linda. If she's in the ledger, the investigation will find her. And her debt," Jack met her eyes. "Part of what Carl will push for is restitution. Cancellation of illegal debt instruments. It's not guaranteed, but it's part of the ask." Maria looked at the counter, at the notepad under it. Then she looked back at Jack. "Good," she said, and went back to work. The camera above the coffee machine had been recording for just over 3 hours now. It had captured everything from the moment the door had burst open to Carl Whitfield's departure, to the quiet, tired, particular quality of the diner in the aftermath of something that nobody had a clean word for. It had captured conversations that none of the participants would ever be able to fully reconstruct from memory alone. It had captured the exact moment that Ethan Cole had put his gun on the table. The exact moment Travis had handed his to Jack. The exact moment Carl had looked at 11 photographs on a phone screen and said it was enough. Nobody in the diner knew how much the camera had caught. Nobody thought about it in those early morning hours as important. They would, soon enough. But right now, Jack Sullivan was drinking coffee at 3 in the morning in the corner booth of a diner that smelled like burnt grounds and old leather, surrounded by the remnants of a night that had started as a robbery and become something he didn't yet have a name for. And he was thinking about a 3-year-old girl who had learned to walk again, and about a ledger in a safe in a pawn shop on the south side of Flagstaff, and about the particular look on Carl Whitfield's face when he'd heard the name Raymond Stills III. He was thinking about the machinery, about how it worked, about the men who built it and the men who got caught in it, and the vast, complicated distance between those two groups, and how occasionally, not often, not predictably, but occasionally the machinery broke in ways that the men who built it had never anticipated. He was thinking about the camera, not consciously, not in any direct way, just a peripheral awareness, the way you were sometimes aware of something in the edge of your vision without turning to look at it directly. Above the coffee machine, recording. His phone buzzed a third time. This time it wasn't Carl. It was Bobby Flores, who had been sitting at the same table for 20 minutes with his phone in his hands, looking up Raymond Stills III, with the quiet efficiency that had made him valuable in 2 very different organizational structures over the course of his life. The text said, "You need to see this, not over the phone. When you get a minute." Jack looked across the diner at Bobby. Bobby was looking back at him with an expression that was hard to read at distance, but that Jack had known long enough to interpret accurately. It wasn't alarm. Bobby didn't alarm easily. It was the expression of a man who had found something significantly larger than what he'd been looking for. Jack set down his cup. He stood up from the booth for the first time in over 3 hours, his knees registering the complaint of a 57-year-old body that had been sitting in one position too long, and he walked across the diner to Bobby's table. Bobby turned the phone and showed him the screen. Jack read it. He read it again. Then he looked up at Bobby and said very quietly, "Raymond Stills III isn't just on the oversight committee." "No," Bobby said. "He chairs it." "He chairs it," Bobby confirmed. "Has for 2 years. He controls which judicial misconduct complaints get investigated and which ones get tabled. He decides which cases involving law enforcement get reviewed and which ones disappear." Bobby took his phone back. "He's not just protection for Nolan Pruitt. He's the reason nobody Nolan has ever bought has ever faced consequences." Jack stood still for a moment. Then he walked back to his booth and picked up his phone and texted Carl Whitfield 3 words. "Raymond Stills chairs it." The response came back in under a minute. "I know. That's why I'm not sleeping tonight." Jack put his phone down. Outside on the empty highway, no trucks were passing. The night had gone completely quiet in the way that nights went quiet in the high desert, in the hours before the sky started to change. The neon sign above the diner hummed its single-note hum. The camera above the coffee machine recorded the stillness. And somewhere in Phoenix, in the kitchen of his house, Carl Whitfield was on the phone with a federal agent, speaking in the careful, precise language that attorneys used when they were holding something that couldn't be dropped and couldn't be rushed. Something that had to be carried exactly right or it would shatter before it reached the people who needed to see it. 40 miles south of the diner in Nolan Pruitt's pawn shop, nothing was moving. The safe was still closed. The ledger was still inside it. Nolan Pruitt was asleep as far as anyone knew in the house he owned outright in the neighborhood, that his money had bought him under the protection he believed was permanent and total and untouchable. He did not know about the 11 photographs on a phone in the custody of a federal attorney. He did not know about the FBI field agent who was at that moment being pulled from sleep in Phoenix by a phone call from Carl Whitfield. He did not know about the camera in Sunset Junction Diner. He did not know about any of it. That was about to change. The FBI arrived at 6:14 in the morning, not one agent, 3. Jack Sullivan was still in the corner booth when they came through the door. He had not left, had not slept, had drunk somewhere between 7 and 9 cups of coffee by that point, and was operating on the particular clear-headed exhaustion that came from a night when too much had happened to permit the ordinary shutdown of the mind. Wrench had fallen asleep in his chair sometime around 4:30, and nobody had woken him. Pete had gone outside twice to make phone calls that he hadn't explained and Jack hadn't asked about. Bobby had been on his phone for most of 3 hours, moving between silent reading and occasional short texts sent with the focused economy of a man conducting research he wasn't going to summarize until he had something complete. Maria was still there. She shouldn't have been. Her shift had ended at midnight 6 hours ago, but nobody had suggested she leave and she hadn't offered to. And somewhere around 4 a.m., she had made herself a cup of tea and sat down at the counter and stayed. The 2 truckers had finally gone. They'd left together sometime after 3, the older one placing a hand briefly on Jack's shoulder as he passed without saying anything. The younger one pausing at the door and looking back at the room for a moment with an expression that was difficult to interpret and then leaving without explanation. Jack had not gotten their names. He thought about that sometimes afterward. When the agents came in, they came in way federal agents always came in with a calibrated neutrality that was itself a form of authority, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself loudly because it didn't need to. The one in front was a woman, early 40s, brown hair pulled back, wearing a jacket over dark slacks and carrying a leather bag that was clearly heavy. Her name, Jack would learn, was Special Agent Diana Reyes, and she had been with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Phoenix for 11 years. She looked at the diner. She looked at Jack. She looked at the camera above the coffee machine. Then she looked back at Jack. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "Carl Whitfield sends his regards. He also says you make better coffee than he does, which I'll be able to verify in about 30 seconds. Maria was already reaching for the pot. Agent Reyes sat down across from Jack. Her 2 colleagues, both men, both younger, both wearing the same calibrated neutrality, took positions at the counter without being directed to. They had the practiced, unobtrusive quality of people trained to be in a room without dominating it. I've read Carl's preliminary briefings, Reyes said. She was looking at Jack, but she was also, without making it obvious, assessing the diner, the room, the layout, the camera. And I've looked at the photographs. All 11, Jack said. All 11. She accepted the coffee from Maria with a small nod of thanks. I want to ask you something directly, Mr. Sullivan, before we get into the formal process. Jack. She wrapped both hands around the cup. How did you know those two men were not going to hurt anyone? Because what Carl described, the way you handled that situation, most people don't respond the way you responded. Most people hit the floor. Jack looked at her steadily. Most people haven't spent 39 years reading people in rooms where the stakes are high. That's a diplomatic answer. It's an honest one. She studied him for a moment, then she gave a very small nod, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement, and moved on. The footage from the security camera, she said. We're going to need it. Jack looked at Maria. Maria said, the system is owned by the diner. It records to a hard drive in the back office. I can get you the owner's contact information. Jack owns it, actually. Reyes looked at Jack. It's my diner, Jack said. Has been for 11 years. Something shifted in Reyes' expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a piece clicking into a place she hadn't expected to find it. Carl didn't mention that. Carl doesn't know everything about me, Jack said. Just enough. Can we access the footage? You can have all of it, Jack said. From last night and from whatever prior recordings are still on the drive. If Nolan has been running loan collections that pass through this area, there's a chance his people have come through here before. I want to know if any of them are on that footage. Reyes set her cup down. She looked at him with the particular attention of someone recalibrating a situation in real time. You've been thinking about this all night. I've had time, Jack said. One of the agents at the counter pulled out a laptop without being asked. He looked at Reyes, who gave a small nod, and he stood up and walked toward the back office with Maria leading the way. Reyes looked at Bobby Flores, who had been sitting quietly at the adjacent table with his phone face down. You found something on stills, she said. It wasn't a question. Bobby looked at Jack. Jack nodded. Bobby picked up his phone and placed it on the table in front of Reyes. She looked at the screen. She scrolled slowly. She read for about 90 seconds and the calibrated neutrality held, but her jaw tightened once a single brief contraction, and Jack saw it. Where did you find this? She asked. Public records, Bobby said. Campaign finance filings, county zoning variants, approvals, judicial appointment confirmations. It's all publicly available. Nobody put it together in one place before. Raymond Stills III received campaign contributions from 3 shell companies, Reyes said, still looking at the phone. Not asking, confirming, reading aloud to herself. Over a 4-year period, Bobby said. Total contribution is $218,000. All 3 shell companies were incorporated in Nevada. 2 of them dissolved within 6 months of the contribution. The third is still technically active, but has filed no business activity since its formation. Reyes set the phone down. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, not dramatically, just briefly, the gesture of someone letting a large piece of information settle into a structure that already exists and finding that it fits exactly where it should. The inquiry that was shut down 18 months ago, Jack said. The predatory lending investigation. It was shelved by the Oversight Committee. I'm aware of that inquiry, Reyes said. Stills chaired the vote to shelve it. I'm aware of that too, she looked at Jack. What I was not aware of until Carl called me at 3 this morning was the connection between Stills and Pruitt. The shell companies are new information. Combined with what's on those photographs, she stopped, started again. Combined with the photographs, we have a thread. Pull it, Jack said. That's my intention, she said. From the back office, the sound of the younger agent's voice, low and professional, speaking into a phone. Then a pause, then footsteps, and the agent came back out and leaned toward Reyes and said something quiet that Jack couldn't hear. Reyes's expression didn't change, but she sat up slightly. How much of last night? She asked. All of it, the agent said. The camera has a 48-hour rolling buffer, high-resolution audio capture. The room processed that. Maria turned from behind the counter. Audio, she said. The newer systems record both, the agent said. If the owner specified audio capture when it was installed. I did, Jack said. He said it without any particular emphasis, just matter of fact. Pete, who had come back inside at some point without Jack noticing, said, "Boom, Jack." The same way he'd said it the night before, the single word check-in. Security, Jack said simply. When you own a place on a highway and you're known, you want a record. Always. He looked at Reyes. Whatever's on that audio, you have it. Reyes looked at the camera above the coffee machine. Then she looked at Jack. Mr. Sullivan, Jack. She paused. Do you understand what's on that recording? I have a general idea, he said. I mean specifically. Everything that was said last night. Every name, every detail about the ledger. Ethan Cole's testimony essentially in full in context with Ethan Cole's own voice on it. She held his gaze. That is extraordinarily significant from an evidentiary standpoint. A defense attorney will challenge the photographs. Chain of custody, manner of acquisition, conditions under which they were taken. But a contemporaneous audio recording of voluntary testimony is harder to challenge, Jack said, substantially harder. She looked at the camera again. Then, you knew it was recording and when you kept him talking. Jack said nothing. You kept redirecting the conversation back to specifics, she said. Names, dates, dollar amounts, the ledger, the safe. She leaned forward slightly. You were building a record. Jack picked up his coffee cup. He drank, set it down. I told you, he said. I've had time to think. He had known from the moment Carl Whitfield walked in the door that the conversation happening in this diner was significant. He had known from the moment Ethan Cole said the name Nolan Pruitt and then immediately said the name of a cop, not a cop, a lieutenant, that this was not a small story. And he had known sitting in his corner booth with 39 years of reading rooms and reading people that the camera above the coffee machine was recording everything and that everything mattered. He had not said this to anyone. He had not orchestrated it in any way that he could have been accused of orchestrating. He had simply kept asking questions and kept the conversation in the specific rather than the general, and trusted that the camera was doing what it was designed to do. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was absolutely nothing dramatic. Just stay in the room, keep asking, keep listening, let it record. Reyes looked at him for a long moment. Then she said with the small, compressed version of a smile that was probably the most expression she allowed herself in a professional setting. Carl said you were an unusual man. Carl's been saying that for 12 years, Jack said. The morning moved fast after that, faster than any of them had expected. By 7 a.m. a forensic technician had arrived and was in the back office with the hard drive. By 7:30, Carl Whitfield had arrived in person, having apparently not slept at all, wearing the same jacket he'd been wearing when he left at 2 in the morning, and carrying a coffee that he'd clearly bought from somewhere else and was already finished with. By 8 o'clock, Reyes had made 2 phone calls that she made outside, standing in the parking lot, that lasted a combined total of 17 minutes. When she came back in from the second one, she sat down across from Jack and she said, "We're moving on the pawn shop today." Jack's hand tightened on his cup. Today. This morning. We don't have a warrant yet, but the application is in front of a federal judge right now. Based on the photographs and the audio, the application will be approved. She looked at her watch. Probably within 2 hours. Stills, Jack asked. Stills is a separate proceeding. We move on Pruitt first. What comes out of the safe, if the ledger is what Cole described, will determine what happens with Stills. She paused. But based on what's on those photographs, the connection to the shell companies, and the pattern of the judicial suppression, she paused again. Raymond Stills III will not be chairing anything by the end of this week. The words landed with a weight that nobody in the room responded to immediately. It was too large for an immediate response. It had the quality of things that were true, but that required a moment to become real. The gap between hearing and actually believing. Pete exhaled. Bobby set his phone down. Wrench, who had woken up at some point during the arrival of the agents and had been sitting quietly with a cup of coffee and listening to everything, said nothing at all. He just nodded once to himself with the expression of a man who had lived long enough to know that the world occasionally unexpectedly bent towards something that resembled justice, and that when it did, the appropriate response was not to talk about it, but to register it. Ethan and Travis, Jack said. Carl has the cooperation agreement in draft form, Reyes said. It will be formalized once we confirm what's in the safe, but the framework is there. She looked at Jack directly. They cooperated fully and voluntarily. The recordings support that. Their testimony was offered without coercion in full detail before they had any guarantee of protection. She paused. That matters. That matters a lot. Ethan has a daughter, Jack said. I know, Rhea said. Carl told me. She's 3. She just learned to walk again after surgery. Reyes looked at him. Her expression had something in it now that the calibrated neutrality hadn't permitted before. Not unprofessional, just human. I have a daughter, she said. She's 7. She picked up her cup. I heard him last night, on the recording. She didn't explain which part she meant. She didn't need to. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Carl came over from where he'd been talking to one of the younger agents and sat down next to Reyes. He looked at Jack. He looked like a man who had not slept and did not care because the thing he was holding was too important to put down for sleep. The warrant's coming through, Carl said. Diana just told you. She did. When this breaks, Carl started. He stopped, organized his thoughts. Jack, when this breaks, publicly, and it will, because there are reporters who cover the federal courts, and they will see the warrant application when it breaks, the diner is going to be part of the story. The footage is going to be part of the story. I understand that, Jack said. The camera above the coffee machine, Carl said. That's the center of the evidentiary case. Everything else we can corroborate or challenge or argue. But that audio recording, that is the spine of it. And when it comes out that it was recorded here in this diner by a security camera that the owner of the diner chose to equip with audio, he looked at Jack. People are going to have opinions about that. People always have opinions, Jack said. Jack. Carl. A pause. Carl said, Are you ready for this to be a very large story? Jack looked at the camera. He looked at Maria, who was cleaning the same section of counter she had cleaned 3 times this morning. He looked at the booth where Ethan and Travis had sat, at the table where the notepad still was the one that Ethan had filled with names that Maria had placed under the counter and that was now in an evidence bag. I was sitting in my booth drinking coffee, Jack said. 2 men came in with guns. I talked to them. The camera recorded it. He shrugged, not dismissive, just precise. That's what happened. People can have whatever opinions about it they want. Carl looked at him for a moment. Then he said, I've known you for 12 years. You have. You remain the most difficult man to explain to people who haven't met you. I appreciate that, Jack said. He meant it. At 9:47 in the morning, Carl Whitfield received a text from a colleague monitoring the federal court system. He read it. He looked up. Warrants issued, he said. The room shifted. Not dramatically, nobody stood up or raised their voice or did anything cinematic. But something changed in the air, the way air changed before a storm that was still far away but definitely coming. Reyes was already on her phone. She spoke for about 40 seconds, then hung up. She looked at her 2 colleagues. We're moving, she said. She stood up. She looked at Jack. The footage will be secured and kept under federal seal until trial, she said. You'll receive documentation confirming custody. She picked up her bag. On behalf of the Bureau, she stopped, started again differently as if the formal language had felt wrong and she was choosing the real one. Thank you. What happened here last night could have gone a dozen different ways. It went this way because you made specific choices. She met his eyes. That matters. Jack nodded. She walked out. The diner was quiet again. The third quiet of the morning, different from the first 2. Not the quiet of aftermath. Not the quiet of waiting, something else. The quality of a room where something had completed. Jack sat in his booth. Maria came over with the coffee pot. She poured without asking for what Jack had lost count of as the number of times she'd done that since midnight. So, she said. So, Jack said. She sat down across from him in the booth. She had never in the 11 years Jack had owned the diner and she had worked there sat down across from him in the booth during a shift. They both registered this without commenting on it. The footage is going to go public, she said. Eventually, Jack said, when the legal process allows. And the part where, she paused, the part where the gunman's hand was shaking, and you told him you could see it. That's on there. And the part where you asked Ethan how much trouble he was really in. That's on there too. Maria was quiet for a moment. People are going to watch that. Probably. She looked at the camera above the coffee machine. She had looked at it probably 24 times since midnight, and each time with a slightly different expression. This time the expression was thoughtful. Not awed, just thoughtful, the way a person looked at something they were trying to fully comprehend. I want to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. When Travis pointed the gun at you the second time when he raised it and everyone thought, she stopped, started again. You didn't move. You just set the cup down and looked at him. She looked at Jack. Were you scared? Jack thought about this. He gave it the honesty it deserved. Yeah, he said. I was scared. Maria blinked. She had clearly expected a different answer. I'm 57 years old, Jack said. I've been scared plenty of times. Being scared doesn't mean you move. It means your body is paying attention. He looked at the booth across from him, the empty booth, the one where Ethan had sat. I was scared, and I could see that he was more scared than I was. And I thought if I move, he moves. If I stay still, there's still a chance he stays still. He paused. So I stayed still. Maria looked at him for a long time. That's remarkable, she said quietly. It's arithmetic, Jack said. She almost smiled. Then she looked at the camera one more time. 50 million people are going to watch this footage, she said. Aren't they? Jack looked at the camera above the coffee machine. The small, ordinary camera that had been up there for 11 years, that he'd installed because you needed a record. Because in his experience, records were the only thing that protected you when powerful men decided you didn't need protecting. He hadn't thought about 50 million people. He thought about it now. He thought about Linda in the waiting room of Nolan Pruitt's pawn shop, crying and trying not to show it. He thought about Kenny Marsh, 29 years old, walking with a cane because a hit and run that wasn't a hit and run. He thought about the 64 families that number would come later in the discovery phase of the investigation, but somehow Jack was already sensing the scale of it. He thought about all the people who had sat in Nolan Pruitt's waiting room and signed documents they were too desperate to read carefully and had been paying for it ever since. He thought about Ethan Cole somewhere in Carl Whitfield's office, signing a cooperation agreement that was going to make the next year of his life complicated and frightening and ultimately navigable. He thought about a 3-year-old girl who had learned to walk again. Maybe, Jack said. He picked up his coffee cup. Maybe they will. He drank. And the camera above the coffee machine, small, ordinary, unchanged from the night before, went on recording an empty room in the morning light the way it always did, the way it had for 11 years, doing the only thing it had ever been designed to do, holding the record, keeping it safe, waiting for the moment it would matter. That moment was already here. The warrant was executed at 10:22 in the morning. Jack knew the exact time because Carl texted him the moment it happened. A single line, no punctuation. The compressed communication of a man who was watching something unfold in real time and had one hand free to type, "They're in." Jack was still at the diner. He hadn't left. He had no particular plan to leave until he knew how it ended, and he understood in the way that a man understood things after a long night with no sleep and too much coffee. That ended was a flexible word. Some things ended cleanly. Some things ended in stages, like a fire that went out in one room and kept burning in another, and you had to stay until you were sure. He showed the text to nobody. He just held the phone and sat with it for a moment, and then he set it down and picked up his cup, and the coffee was cold again, and he drank it anyway. Maria saw his face. She had learned over 11 years to read the small changes in Jack Sullivan's expression, the way a sailor read weather, not in the dramatic signals, but in the subtle ones, the barely there shifts that preceded everything significant. She didn't ask. She went to the coffee machine and made a fresh pot, and while it was brewing, she stood with her back to the room and her hands on the counter and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of the night that was now turning into a morning that was turning into something else entirely. She had been scared. She needed to let herself know that. Scared the way your body went cold from the inside when a door burst open and a gun came up. Scared in the way that didn't fully process until later, until the adrenaline cleared and left behind the clean, honest knowledge of how close everything had come to going another way. But it hadn't gone another way. She turned around and poured Jack a fresh cup and didn't say anything, and he thanked her without words, the small nod of a man who knew what the gesture meant. Wrench's phone rang first. He looked at the screen, then at Jack. "It's Danny Reeves," he said. Danny Reeves ran a garage on the east side and had a police scanner that he treated like a personal news service. He's hearing chatter. "What kind?" Wrench put the phone to his ear, listened for about 20 seconds. His face stayed neutral, but his eyes sharpened. "Multiple units responding to the south side, not county federal. Someone on the scanner is calling it a major enforcement action." Pete leaned forward. "Already. Federal moves fast when the warrant's clean," Jack said. They had everything they needed before they walked in. Bobby was already on his phone. He had 3 different news sources open, refreshing in rotation. Nothing was public, yet the press didn't move at law enforcement speed, but Bobby had his own network of information that operated through different channels, and he was watching all of them simultaneously. Carl called at 10:41. Jack picked up on the first ring. "The safe was open when they entered," Carl said. His voice had a quality Jack had never heard in it before. Not excitement exactly, Carl was too disciplined for excitement, but a kind of sustained intensity, like a current running through a wire at maximum capacity. "Pruitt was on the premises. He tried to close it when he heard them come in. Didn't make it." "The ledger," Jack said. "In the safe, along with 3 additional ledgers that Ethan didn't know existed." A pause. "Jack, this is not 64 families. This is not a regional operation. The additional ledgers cover activity going back 9 years. The number of affected borrowers, they don't have a count yet, but the preliminary estimate from the agent on scene is somewhere north of 400 individuals across 6 states. Jack set his cup down. 400 people. 9 years. He sat with that for a moment. Sat with the weight of it, not the abstract number, but what the number represented. 400 people who had walked into a pawn shop in desperation and walked out with a lifeline that was a trap. 400 people who had been paying week after week while the numbers grew and the threats arrived and the options narrowed to nothing. 400 people who did not know this morning that the safe had just been opened. "Pruitt is in custody," Jack asked. "Taken off premises at 10:38. Federal holding." Carl paused again. His attorney, the one he called immediately, is Raymond Stills III's personal attorney. The same firm. Another pause, this one deliberate letting that land, which will be, from an investigation standpoint, extremely useful. Jack looked at the camera above the coffee machine. "Carl," he said, "how long before the footage goes public?" "It's federal evidence. It stays under seal through the investigation and trial." Carl's voice shifted slightly. "However, the diner footage includes audio of a voluntary conversation between private citizens in a private establishment. There are arguments to be made about what portions of it and under what conditions could eventually be released. That's a legal conversation for another day." He stopped. "Why?" "Because people need to see it," Jack said. "Not for the case. After the case. People need to see what happened in this room last night." A long pause. "Jack," Carl said, "let me get Pruitt into federal court first." "I know," Jack said. "I'm not asking for now. I'm asking you to think about eventually." "I'm thinking," Carl said. "I'll call you when there's more." He hung up. Jack looked at Wrench, Pete, and Bobby. He told them what Carl had told him. The 4 men sat in silence for a moment with the number 406 states, 9 years hanging in the air between them. Pete said, "Kenny Marsh." "I know," Jack said. "He's one of the 400. "Probably." "He walks with a cane," Pete said. "He's 29 years old, and he walks with a cane because Nolan Pruitt had someone break his hand." "I know, Pete. I just want to say it out loud," Pete said. "Once, so it's said." He looked at the table. "Okay, I'm done." Bobby put his phone down. He had been reading something, and his expression had changed in the specific way it changed when he found something that rearranged his understanding of a situation. "What?" Jack said. "Raymond Stills III issued a statement 20 minutes ago," Bobby said. "Through his office. He says he has no knowledge of Nolan Pruitt or any predatory lending operation, and that he welcomes any investigation that serves to protect Arizona consumers." Bobby looked up. He also announced that he is voluntarily stepping back from his duties on the Oversight Committee pending a review. The room processed that. "He already knew who," Wrench said. "Someone told him," Bobby said. "Someone in the federal process between midnight and now made a call they shouldn't have made and told Stills that his name was in play." "Can they trace that?" Pete asked. "They will try," Jack said. His voice was flat. Not angry, Jack Sullivan's anger had never been a loud thing, had never been something that rose in his voice or showed in his face. It was always when it existed a quiet and settled thing like water that had been sitting in the dark for a long time and was very cold and very still and very deep. And whoever made that call will be part of the investigation. Still stepping back voluntarily, Maria said from behind the counter. Everyone looked at her. She had been listening as she had been listening all morning, and she spoke with the particular directness of someone who had been quiet long enough to have thought it all the way through. That's not innocence. That's someone trying to control a story before the story controls him. Wrench looked at her. 11 years, Jack said to no one in particular. She's been working here 11 years, and every time I think I've heard everything she's going to say. He looked at Maria. You're right. Maria lifted her chin slightly. She knew she was right. She'd known it for about 3 minutes. She just hadn't been sure whether to say it. The statement is going to backfire, Bobby said. Federally, you don't voluntarily step back from a committee you chair because of an investigation you claim to know nothing about. You step back because you know exactly what's coming and you're trying to minimize the damage. He looked at Jack. That statement is going to be in every legal filing from this point forward as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Jack nodded slowly. Then his phone buzzed. Not Carl this time. A number he didn't recognize, Phoenix area code, but not in his contacts. He almost didn't answer. Then he did. Mr. Sullivan, a woman's voice, older, careful. My name is Linda Carr. I was given this number by a pause. By a young man named Ethan Cole. He said I should call you. Jack straightened in his booth. Mrs. Carr, he said. Yes, I'm here. Ethan told me. Her voice broke. She stopped, collected herself with the particular effort of a woman who had been keeping herself collected for a very long time through sheer force of will and was approaching the limit of it. He told me that last night something happened. He said I should call you because he thought things might be different now. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Is that true? He said the safe was opened. He said Nolan Pruitt is in federal custody this morning, Jack said. He said it directly without preamble because she had been waiting a long time for something direct, and he was not going to make her wait any longer. The ledgers are in federal possession. If your loan is in those ledgers, it is now evidence in a federal case, and illegal debt instruments identified in a federal investigation are subject to cancellation proceedings. Silence. Then Linda Carr made a sound that Jack Sullivan would never fully be able to describe to anyone who asked him about it later. It was not a cry exactly, and it was not a laugh, and it was not simply relief. It was the sound a person made when something that had been pressing on them for so long that they had stopped remembering what it felt like to not have it pressing on them when that thing suddenly wasn't there anymore. The sudden absence of a weight that had become so familiar, it had started to feel like a permanent part of the architecture of life. 2 years, she said. She said it the way Ethan had said 8 months, flat, without inflection, because the number was too large for inflection. I've been paying him for 2 years. I know, Jack said. Mrs. Carr, I need you to do something for me. Anything, she said immediately. I need you to call this number. He read her Carl Whitfield's number from memory. His name is Carl Whitfield. He's an attorney. He is representing the interests of Pruitt's borrowers in the federal proceeding. Your loan documentation, anything you have, every payment receipt, every piece of communication from Pruitt's operation, you gather all of it, and you call that number today. Today, she repeated. Today. Don't wait. Carl is expecting calls. He paused. You are not alone in this, Mrs. Carr. There are a great many people in exactly your situation, and they are all going to be heard. She was quiet for a moment. Then Ethan said, you were something else. Ethan's a good man who got caught in bad machinery, Jack said. That's all. He hung up. He put the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Maria, who had heard every word and whose eyes were doing something that she was very deliberately not drawing attention to, and he looked at Wrench and Pete and Bobby, and he picked up his coffee cup. How many more Linda Carrs are there? Pete said quietly. 400 roughly, Jack said. Give or take. Nobody said anything. The morning continued. Carl called 4 more times before noon. The progression of those calls told the story in compressed form. First call, Pruitt had requested a lawyer and stopped talking. Second call, the additional ledgers had been transferred to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Phoenix for processing. Third call, a federal judge had signed a temporary injunction freezing all active collection activity associated with Pruitt's loan operation across all 6 states. Fourth call, Raymond Stills III had retained criminal defense counsel. That last one Jack received while standing in the parking lot, the October sun hitting his face for the first time since the night before, warm and specific and real, in the way that things were real after a long night that had started in darkness. He stood in the parking lot for a few minutes after the call ended. He could hear faintly through the diner's walls the sound of Maria moving inside the familiar rhythm of a woman who knew her space completely and moved through it without wasted motion. He could hear Pete's voice low, talking to someone on the phone. He could hear further away the highway, the constant background presence of engines and distance and people moving through the world in the direction of wherever they were going. He thought about the night before, the door opening, the 2 men and the guns, and the 53 people on the floor. The particular quality of that silence when Travis had raised the shotgun and everyone had understood what it might mean. He thought about setting down the coffee cup. He thought about asking the only question that had mattered. How much trouble are you really in? He had not planned that question. He had not rehearsed it or strategized it. He had asked it because it was the honest question, the real question, the question that cut through everything that was being performed in that room and reached for what was actually true. He had been asking it his whole life in one form or another of every person he had encountered who was presenting one thing while being something else underneath it. He went back inside. The story broke publicly at 2:17 in the afternoon. Not the footage, not yet. What broke first was the raid on the pawn shop, which 3 local TV stations had camera crews outside of by 11 a.m., in which the FBI's Phoenix field office confirmed at 2 o'clock with a brief statement that said federal charges were pending against Nolan Pruitt for racketeering, predatory lending, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The statement mentioned that the investigation involved activity across 6 states and multiple individuals and was ongoing. It did not mention the diner. It did not mention the camera. It did not mention 2 young men who had walked in with guns and walked out with something they hadn't come in looking for. Not yet. That came 17 days later. Carl Whitfield had argued correctly that the footage should remain under federal seal through Pruitt's arraignment and preliminary hearings. But once the arraignment was complete and the evidentiary framework was established, a federal judge approved limited release of a specific portion of the recording for use in the government's public statement on the scope of the investigation. The portion approved for release was 4 minutes and 22 seconds long. It began with the door opening. It ended with Ethan Cole placing his gun on the table. In between those 2 moments, it showed everything. The raised weapons and the terrified room and the 2 truckers going still at the counter. It showed Jack Sullivan not moving. It showed Maria frozen with the coffee pot. It showed Jack picking up his cup and drinking from it with a loaded gun in the room, and saying in a voice that was flat and unhurried and completely certain of itself, "My hands are busy." It showed Travis raising the shotgun. It showed Jack setting the cup down. And it showed, in the angle the camera had on the booth, the wide-angle view that captured both faces simultaneously, the exact moment Jack said, "You still have one good decision left tonight," and the exact moment Travis Boyd's hand began to shake, and the exact moment the shotgun came down. 22 seconds. That was the section that got clipped first. The section that someone posted to social media with no context other than the location and the date. Within 6 hours, it had been viewed 8 million times. Within 24 hours, 40 million. Within 48 hours, the number had passed 53 million and was still climbing, and the clip had been covered by every major news network in the country and several international outlets. And the comment sections were something that Jack Sullivan was specifically and deliberately not reading because he had never been a man who needed to know what strangers thought of him. But Maria read them. She read them at the counter of the diner in the quiet hours between the lunch rush, which was for the first time in the 11 years she had worked there, and actual rush cars filling the parking lot, people who had driven from Flagstaff and Sedona and Prescott specifically to sit in the booth where it had happened, and she read them, and occasionally she said nothing, and occasionally she said something short and quiet that nobody near her needed to respond to. A woman in Ohio says she had a loan shark too, Maria said at one point to no one in particular. Her story's different, but it's the same. She said watching the footage made her feel like someone finally understood what it was like. Jack in his booth said nothing. A veteran in Georgia, Maria said a few minutes later. He says he almost did something like what Ethan did 2 years ago. He said he doesn't know what stopped him. She paused. He says he's glad he didn't. Jack said nothing. A man in Minnesota. Maria stopped. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he says his brother died because of a loan shark, couldn't pay. The brother, she stopped again, set the phone down. He says he wishes his brother had found a different diner. The diner was quiet for a long moment. Then Jack said, what's the man's name? Maria looked at the phone. David Krause, Minneapolis. Jack held out his hand for the phone. Maria looked at him. Give me the phone, he said. She gave it to him. He found the comment. He typed a reply. He handed the phone back. Maria read what he'd written. It was short. 4 sentences. It said, your brother's story matters. What happened to him should not have happened. The men responsible for operations like the one that hurt your family are in federal court right now because a young man found the courage to stop. I am sorry for your loss. Maria looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Jack. You signed it Jack Sullivan, she said. It's my name, he said. She handed the phone back. She went back to work. The federal case against Nolan Pruitt moved through the court system with the particular momentum of a case that had been built cleanly and completely before anyone had a chance to compromise it. Carl Whitfield represented 67 of the affected borrowers in the civil proceedings. A federal public defenders coalition took on the remaining cases. By the end of the first month, 112 illegal debt instruments had been identified and flagged for cancellation. By the end of the third month, the number was 291. Raymond Stills III was indicted 8 weeks after the raid. The indictment listed 9 counts including bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. His resignation from the Oversight Committee submitted the morning after the raid, in what he had clearly imagined was a protective gesture, was cited in the indictment as evidence of consciousness of guilt, exactly as Bobby Flores had predicted, standing in the diner that morning. Ethan Cole's cooperation agreement was formalized. He served no prison time. He completed 120 hours of community service, which he did at a legal aid clinic that helped families navigate predatory lending situations, and which he did according to everyone who worked with him. There, with the particular intensity of a man who understood from the inside exactly what the people he was helping were going through. Travis Boyd entered a rehabilitation program for the anxiety disorder that had been untreated for most of his adult life and that had contributed in ways neither he nor anyone else had fully understood at the time to the decisions that had led him to the door of Sunset Junction Diner on a Wednesday night in October. He completed the program. He found work. He was not in the years that followed in any police database for anything that mattered. Linda Carr's debt was among the first to be formally canceled. 2 years and 4 months of payments, every receipt of which she had kept in a shoebox under her bed, were entered into the federal record, and her loan instrument was voided. Carl Whitfield called her to tell her. She was quiet on the phone for a long time, and then she said thank you, and then she cried, and then she apologized for crying, and Carl told her she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. Kenny Marsh was contacted by the federal investigators in month 2. His case, the hit and run that wasn't a hit and run, the hand that didn't work right, the years of walking with a cane at 29, became one of the 6 witness intimidation counts in the expanded indictment. He testified in federal court. He walked to the stand slowly with the cane, and he did not look at Nolan Pruitt's defense table, and he told the truth in a level voice for 40 minutes. And when he was done, he walked back out the same way he'd walked in. Nolan Pruitt was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. He was sentenced to 19 years. Raymond Stills III pleaded guilty to 3 counts in exchange for cooperation with federal prosecutors investigating his broader network. He was sentenced to 7 years and disbarred from public office for life. The sentencing was reported in the news. It was not by that point a major story. Major stories move fast and then the world moves on, and by the time the sentencing happened, the world had largely moved on from the footage and the diner and the 22 seconds of a shaking hand and a coffee cup. But some things didn't move on. Some things stayed. 7 months after the night it all began on a Thursday afternoon in May, When the Arizona heat was starting to build towards summer, the front door of Sunset Junction Diner opened and Ethan Cole walked in. He was not wearing a hoodie. He was not wearing a bandana. He was wearing a plain blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up and jeans and work boots, the same work boots he'd been wearing that night, and he was carrying flowers. Yellow ones, the kind you bought from the supermarket because you weren't trying to be fancy. You were just trying to say something true, and he stopped just inside the door and looked around the room. Maria saw him first. She stopped in the middle of the floor, coffee pot in hand, the same position she'd been frozen in 7 months ago, except this time she wasn't frozen at all. She was just still for a moment looking at him. He held up the flowers. She put the coffee pot down on the nearest table, which was something she had never done in 11 years, and she walked across the diner, and she took the flowers from him, and she stood there holding them and looking at him with a complicated, complete expression of a woman who had been through something with another person and was now looking at the evidence that both of them had survived it. "You look better," she said. "I feel better," he said. "I sleep now. That's it. Sounds small, but it's not." "It's not small," she said. "Lily started preschool," he said. His voice changed when he said his daughter's name the way voices always changed when people said the names of the people they were most afraid of losing. "She loves it. He stopped, collected himself. "She has no idea about any of it. She's 4 years old and she has no idea what her dad almost did." "Good, Aunt Maria said. "Keep it that way as long as you can." "Yeah," he said. "I plan to." He looked past her toward the corner booth. Jack Sullivan was there. Of course he was. Same seat, same cup, same particular quality of occupying a space without filling it with noise. He was looking at Ethan with the direct, uncomplicated attention that he had given him 7 months ago on the worst night of Ethan's life, and which was Ethan had come to understand in the months since, simply the way Jack Sullivan looked at people when he had decided they were worth looking at. Ethan walked over. He stopped at the booth. He looked at Jack Sullivan, at the leather vest and the gray hair and the hands wrapped around the coffee cup, the same hands that had stayed completely still when a gun was pointed at the face they were attached to. "I don't know how to thank you," Ethan said. "Then don't," Jack said. "Sit down." Ethan sat. Maria brought coffee without being asked. She put it down in front of Ethan and went back to work, and the flowers were in a glass of water on the counter, and outside the highway was doing what highways do. And somewhere in Phoenix, in a federal correctional facility, Nolan Pruitt was beginning to understand the meaning of permanent. "Lily's in preschool," Jack said. Ethan blinked. "How did you told Maria? I could hear." Ethan half smiled. The first time Jack had seen him smile, it was a good smile, the kind that reached the eyes and meant what it looked like. "She is," he said. "She loves the finger painting. She comes home covered in it. Casey makes me take her shoes off in the garage because the last time..." He stopped. He was embarrassed by the ordinariness of it, the way people were sometimes embarrassed by ordinary happiness when they had been a long time without it. "Don't stop," Jack said. Ethan looked at him. "Don't stop talking about the finger painting," Jack said. "That's the whole point." Ethan looked at the table, his jaw worked. He nodded once, the same decisive nod that Jack had first seen in this booth at 12:28 in the morning on a Wednesday in October, and which meant the same thing now that it had meant then. "Yes, I understand. I'm going to do the right thing." Above the coffee machine, the camera was still there, still recording. The same camera that had captured the shaking hand and the coffee cup and the 22 seconds that 53 million people had watched, and that had meant something different to every single one of them. Justice, compassion, courage, luck, grace, the inexplicable and stubborn persistence of the possibility that things could go differently than the worst version of how they might go. Jack Sullivan looked at Ethan Cole across the booth in the corner of his diner on a Thursday afternoon in May. He saw a young father who had walked through the worst door of his life and come out the other side. Not because the world had been kind to him, not because the system had worked the way it was supposed to work, not because luck had been evenly distributed, but because on the right night, in the right room, someone had stayed still and asked the right question and listened to the answer. And because a 27-year-old man who was out of road and out of options and out of everything except one last decision had looked at that question and chosen. That was the whole story. That was all of it. And some stories, when they end the right way, don't need anything added to them. They just need to be told.